Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Women Leaders, the podcast that explains global events through discussions with women experts. And welcome to ELN, the European Leadership Network, the home of this podcast. I'm Ilana Bet-El. I'm a Senior Associate Fellow at ELN, and I'm your host for this conversation with women who are leading and shaping the world in many ways and fields. Our last episodes have been focused on the wars in Ukraine and Israel, Gaza, and the world according to China and Russia and the US. But throughout this period, as ever, events are happening elsewhere in the world, notably Africa, that tends to receive passing mentions, mostly of wars and catastrophes. Given this is one of the most populous regions of the world, with 54 recognized states, there is much more happening there for sure. Indeed, so much that the US, China, and Russia are back to competing for interest there. To understand the interests and the continent, we're delighted to have with us Amaka Anku, Africa Practice Head at Eurasia Group, for a really in-depth chat about all the things we don't understand about Africa. Hi, Amaka. It's lovely to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Amaka, let's start as we always do. Can you tell us a bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Amaka Anku. I grew up in Nigeria, have been in the States now for 25 years, at least since the first time I came. I go back often to the continent. I came here for college and I've started my career in the development industry. So working with organizations like Africare and Crisis Group. And then I went to law school. I practiced law for 5 years in big law, corporate law. And then I transitioned to research and analysis, focusing on Africa. And today I run the Africa practice at a global political analysis firm called Eurasia Group. So our clients are about evenly divided between what we call market participants. So they're all investors. They're people who are lending money to to countries all over the world. But for me, most relevant is African countries. So they're lending money, they're moving capital, they're trading currencies, or they're corporate multinationals doing business in Africa. So my job is to help them understand how the politics impacts the economic and business environment and economic outcomes in particular.
That's seriously cool. And you have a team that works for you, I take it.
Yes, yes, yes.
If I may ask, not at the specific, what interests people in Africa? That's a very good way to enter this.
So it depends on obviously depends on who you're thinking about. Like I said, our clients are about evenly divided into two groups. So the first group is what we call the market participants. So think the people who are lending money to governments. For those group, what's most important is sort of high level bottom line. They care about getting paid. So I'm lending you money and I want to make sure that in a year or 2 years or whenever the bond is up, I will get my money back. What does that mean? It means I care about growth, high level. Are you growing so that your revenues will grow so that you don't have to default on the loan to me? I care about foreign exchange, your ability to, export enough so that you earn the dollars that you can use to pay me back. That's also linked to growth, but it can also be linked to political decisions about how to manage your currency. I care about political stability. Is there going to be a war? Are there going to be protests? Are there going to be things that otherwise disrupt the government and your ability to pay me back? So again, it comes back to that bottom line of can I get my money back? And then there's the other category of investors who are actually doing business in these countries. So they are setting up manufacture plants, they're trading, they're selling goods, they're doing other kinds of businesses like telecoms, running telecoms firms or software. And they want to know what are the things that will impact the business environment? What are the bigger trends in terms of demographics? How does it impact the job market? How does it impact the talent space, the ability to recruit people? How does it, if there's going to be an election, what does that mean for tax policy? Political stability is one that everybody cares about, right? Because you can't do business if things are unstable or you have to do business differently. So yeah, so it's everything about basically being able to move capital safely. We like to think about things in terms of what is coming in the future rather than what's happened in the past, so that investors, our clients, are able to move resources in the most efficient way to maximize the potential, not based on what we think will happen in the future, not just what's happening in the past.
Fascinating. And tell me, which countries are the most popular for investment in Africa?
Very good question. Right now, Nigeria is pretty popular. So there are two ways to answer this question. I would say it depends on how you think about it. So let's start historically. South Africa has the most industrialized economy, right? By that, I mean they have the most diverse set of exports base, that have the most complex manufacturing from a low base, to be clear, right? Because on the continent, there's just a lower level of complexity across manufacturing. But compared to the other countries on the continent, South Africa has the most diverse export base and level of manufacturing. So it is popular in the sense of it has the deepest capital markets, very mature financial institutions, very mature currency that is very easy to trade, meaning you can get in and out of the currency relatively easily with low costs. It's easy to settle. And so, because of the very deep financial markets, it is popular with a broad range of investors. And sometimes people are just trading the currency to hedge against the dollar, right? So that's South Africa. Right now, there is a lot of interest and excitement about Nigeria, right? So South Africa historically was one of the is the most popular in terms of the financial markets. South Africa it's about 50 million people, 60 million people, and it's one of the slower growing countries in terms of population. It's only growing at about a little bit above replacement rates. Nigeria, on the other hand, is one of the fastest growing population wise, and it's currently the most populous country. And so if you're thinking in terms of corporate opportunities, longer term sales, Nigeria is more exciting in terms of the potential for growth, right? Not only for you to be able to sell products to Nigerians, but also potentially for Nigerians to be able to buy products from you as they get richer, right? And so there is the current government in Nigeria has done a lot of big fundamental reforms that remove structural distortions in the economy that investors are very excited about in terms of it being able to free up capital for the country to make investments. And so right now, Nigeria is one of the most popular places for investment because it's coming from a low base as well, right? Yes.
What is the population of Nigeria?
So the estimates are about 238, so it's a 240 million. I will put a caveat to that in that there has not been a census in a long time. I know. This is one of the problems with African countries. Very bad data. Hasn't been a census in a while, so it's mostly estimates, right? The best estimate that we have is it's about 240 million, and it's projected to be over 400 million in less than 20 years.
Wow, that's a lot of people.
Yes, that's a lot of people.
That's really a lot of people.
That's a lot of people. And that goes into, I think, one of the biggest risks for the region, right? And the biggest risk, and not just Nigeria, but certainly starting with Nigeria, is that if you look at the world estimates, these are estimates, so they might not all pan out as estimated. But if you look at world population projections, Africa, the continent of Africa, is the only place in the world where you will still have new entrants into the labor force in about from about 2040. Everywhere else, population starts to decline over time, and it's still growing because there's still new people being born. There's still a lot of young people who will still just be entering the labor force, when in other places the rate of growth starts to pan out, right? What does that mean? It means it's a very big challenge for all of these countries to to fast track industrialization, to move from economies that are still very rural. A lot of people are in subsistence agricultural farming, and figure out how to create, and I want to say, mass industrialization. It doesn't have to be all manufacturing. It could be a different path. The historical path has been through manufacturing, but create a lot more jobs that are formalized so that you avoid the worst case scenario of a lot of young people with no jobs, build frustration. What do they end up doing? Right now, and we can talk about this right now, the biggest risk for the region is that we're starting to see a lot of young people who are unemployed and who are turning to militancy,
Yeah.
right?
What are the militants in Nigeria, just as a matter of interest?
So in Nigeria, it's a combination of criminal gangs and some radical Islamist groups, right? A lot of it's not necessarily aligned with like global ideology. It's a lot more opportunistic, but there is some locally bred Islamic extremism that wants to impose an Islamic state in Nigeria. But again, it's much less driven by ideology than it is by economic, poor economic outlook, right? The combination of, so I often say it's not just Nigeria. So in the Sahel region, the region in West Africa that is between the Sahara Desert and sort of the greener savannas. So a lot of these countries that people might have heard of, like Burkina Faso and Niger and Mali and Mauritania, that are semi-dry. In the 70s, there was a huge wave of desertification as a result of global warming that destroyed livelihoods. So a lot of people used to be farmers, pastoralists, and all of a sudden there was no grass for their cattle to eat. The farms have been turned to deserts, and you had a whole bunch of young men. And then you add in Libya blowing up and a lot of small arms from Libya. Now you have idle young men with guns. What do you get? A lot of criminal gang groups as well as violent extremist groups, some of whom are driven by ideology, some of whom are just driven by there's nothing better for us to do. And it's becoming a serious problem in the region with a lot of insecurity, a lot of attacks. And the more
The region you're talking about, the Sahel, or you're talking? Yeah, yeah.
Sahel region, I would argue that the longer you have the more you have, I would say, states that lack the administrative capacity to deliver public goods to their populations, the more people will turn to those kinds of violent activity. And it's a major concern. I would say it's a major risk for the region.
Come back to the Sahel in a minute, but I think you've just touched on something that's very important in itself. Why is there such a problem to create functioning governments?
Yeah.
I mean, you could talk about colonialism, but a lot of these countries, were decolonized now 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Why is it so difficult to create governments?
So many ways to answer that question. Here's what I would say. It's not about so there is a challenge with the lack of administrative capacity. I think the bigger challenge isn't that people can't create governments. And I'll tell you, let me tell you what I think. Let me give you a little bit of a framework for how to think about this, right? So like you said, most of the countries in West Africa are about 65 years post-independence. In the South, on the southern part of the continent, most of those countries are younger post-independence, right? Mozambique, Angola, those countries were getting independence in the 70s and 80s, right? What is common across the region is that the existing political consensus, and I don't know how much people think about. So when I say political consensus, in every country, there needs to be a consensus amongst the elites that allows for political stability. right? It's an elite consensus that business leaders, politicians buy into about this is our purpose, this is our raison d'etre, this is what we're all driving towards together. Okay. In West Africa, the political consensus that have existed since independence has always been against something. So you had the independence era, which was against colonialization. Okay, now we want to get them out. We're going to self-govern. That was the first consensus. And then we had the wave of coups, military coups. And then you had, and for some countries like Nigeria, there was a 5-year period between 1987 in the 1980s or so where there was 5 coups in 5 years, right? It was a big deal. So then you had a new consensus, which was we need to keep these soldiers in the barracks. So the new elite consensus became democracy, right? And mind you, that was aligned with the Cold Era politics, the global Cold Era politics, with America projecting, right, democracy is the best thing since, and it is the best thing since sliced bread. All you need is democracy, and everything else will follow. You know, economic growth and industrialization, all of those things will kind of flow from democracy. A lot of countries bought into that, whether or not, but the new consensus became democracy. Let's keep the soldiers at bay. Again, against something. My argument is I think there's currently a generational shift happening, not only in the fact that you have such a young population across the continent. It's the youngest continent. Average age in a place like Nigeria is 19. So it's that there is a literal age generational shift, but it's also a generational shift happening in terms of the ideas that underpinned the political consensus, which is now there needs to be a shift from we're against colonization, we were against military rule. And I'll tell you how the Sahel fits in, because some people are probably wondering, well, what about new coups happening? We'll get to that in a second. But now there needs to be a consensus in favor of economic transformation. Is my view. Not what you're against, but what you're for, which means that elites all have to buy into this vision and risk their capital for productive ends, not just rent seeking, not just corruption, not just, okay, we're all going to stay stable, so let's share the goods in this way. What that has led to historically has been patronage, right? So the reason I'm saying all this is to answer your question. It's the bigger challenge, in my view, has been about driving economic transformation in a way that allows you to have more resources to invest in productivity, right? And not being so focused on rent seeking. And I believe that if you do that, then you will have governments that have enough money, right, to provide public goods because they're collecting taxes or they're doing those things to provide public goods and do other things that functioning states need to do, right? And so with all of that background, to your question, why is it so hard to create it? I think that it is a mixture of the failure of an elite consensus to focus on economic transformation and productivity and organizing a state that can deliver that versus organizing a state that is delivering patronage. And that's what it comes down to. And I do think that there is a level of evolution to get there. 65 years post-independence is still very young, right? If you compare to Latin America, that is hundreds and centuries now. So
it's always young, and I think your explanation is absolutely fascinating, not least this point of it's always been against something and not for something. And I tend to see, in the same way as colonization was a process, colonization is a process too. Sort of colonization was a process of 400 years. So decolonization, which hopefully won't take 400 years, we cannot just see it as being, you created a state, here's the piece of paper, you're recognized in the UN, let's move on from there. Nonetheless, it is fascinating, the refusal, because you can look at other states that are newly created and say they're functioning, they have an ability to function. do you think it also has something to do, because I do want to come back to the Sahel more specifically in a minute, and of course Sudan, though we agreed that we wouldn't talk a lot about Sudan. Then do you think it has something to do with the fact that colonization cut across tribal existence,
Yeah.
and then
Well,
the states that came in their wake still do that? Or you think
yeah,
that's passé?
so I am personally, as an African and as an analyst, I try to stay away from focusing so much on the colonial era because I agree, yes, it's true, it had its effects. But like you said, Africa was not the only region that was colonized. African countries were not the only countries that were colonized. In many other places were also states that were created across ethnic group. It's not unique to Africa. Even Italy, even France, even Germany were different ethnic groups, right? Like in a way, and had to go through a period of state formation that created a nation out of people that perceived themselves differently. Okay. So that is all true. I think that said, I do think that the level of diversity in these areas and the fact that they are African countries right now are trying to do something that no industrialized region did, which is trying to industrialize as democracies.
Right. Which is very hard.
It's extremely hard. I want to be clear. This is not to say that there's a different path. There are people who question whether democracy is the right path. I do not believe, given the level of diversity we have in the region, that there is another path. I just want to acknowledge that it is a lot harder to do than even the other places that we were talking about earlier. If you look at, Southeast, if you look at the Asian tigers, no, most of them did not industrialize as democracies when you have elections every 4 years, right? The US didn't, Europe didn't, right? None of these places. It's a lot easier. And I always say this, and I look back I read a lot of American history, and I go back and I look at America 65 years post independence, right? Most of the population couldn't vote. People who look like me couldn't vote. People who look like you couldn't vote, right? Until 1910. I mean, women couldn't vote until the 20th century.
Absolutely.
Not
Absolutely.
even all white men could vote, right? It was only landed men. So the point I'm making is it is a lot easier, going back to my point about the political consensus, it is a lot easier to achieve a political consensus when you have a defined group of people who can easily buy into division because they're all coming from a similar background, similar point of view, and they feel and they see their self-interest. If you're talking about like America in the AIDS, we're talking about landed white men, right? Who all have an interest in industrialization for their own protection, for the protection of their property. It's easier. It's not easy. It's easier to create a political consensus around industrialization. It's harder today in Africa because you have to do it. You're trying to industrialize. You have an election in 4 years. You have hundreds of different groups who perceive themselves differently. Nobody has ever put in any work into figuring out how to create a unifying narrative that everybody can find themselves in and have a common purpose that evokes hope that people want to invest in, right? Because a part of it is also creating that perception of we're all working towards this. So I'm willing to risk my capital to create this wealth for everybody. Now there's a lot more mutual distrust. And then you add in the fact that we're working with states that don't have the capacity. You end up with a lot more patronage because you're just thinking, oh, I need to win the next election in
Yeah.
4 years. So what do I need to do to win the next election in 4 years? I need to pay off this group, pay off that group, pay off the other group, maintain stability, make sure there's no war, right? So look, to me, this is why it's harder. Doesn't mean it's impossible. So what do we need to do to overcome this? I think that political leaders in Africa need to do a better job of communicating and rallying people around a clear consensus. In the US, whether it's the Monroe Doctrine, and sometimes it doesn't have to be something that it doesn't have to necessarily be a good thing. Find an enemy right? In a lot of Western countries, it was always that external enemy. It was war. It was we need to industrialize so that they don't come to get us. In China, it's the 100 years of humiliation, right? We can't afford to be humiliated again. Whatever. We need to build it in African countries. Need to figure out how to build a consensus around something that everybody can see themselves in. And so it's us together versus them versus all of us against each other in the one country.
So here comes the white woman from Europe and saying, but I thought you had that consensus. Isn't that about decolonization and hating Europe?
Yeah, but that is exactly, but it's all about what you're against. I'm talking about a consensus about what you're for. Hating them is so the other thing I will say. So this is a very good point that you brought up, which is the farther away we have come from colonization, from the thing that we were saying we were against, from the thing that created the consensus, the less salient it is and the less effective it is, right, in keeping people together or in creating a common purpose. We are now like 65 years from independence. Who remembers the period before independence? It is not an effective way of organizing anybody for anything. It was very effective in the 1960s. There was a lot of excitement. It created a huge momentum for self-determination. It was very effective then. Now, it is not. In the 1990s, the democracy movement was very effective. Now, it is not because most people do not remember, and this is part of why we're seeing coups come back. If you are 20 years old in Nigeria, you don't remember life in a military regime. You never experienced it. If you're 30 years old in South Africa, you don't remember life in apartheid. You never experienced it. Yet the ruling party in South Africa has derived its political legitimacy for 30 years as being the Liberation Party. Okay, we're the Liberation Party. It's 30 years later. I don't care that you're the Liberation Party. What are you for now, right? What are we doing together? So those consensus, they're old, they're cake. We don't care. We need a new consensus now. That is, what are you for? What are you for, right? How do we see ourselves in this new vision? And I think I'm not saying it's easy to do. It's hard to do, very diverse, societies, but African countries need to figure out how to do it
It's
because
so
that's gonna
refreshing to
be,
hear this. It really
yeah,
is, because you look at Africa from the outside, and I've visited many times and I love it, but you say there's so much potential. So it's
yeah.
great to hear that others see the same thing there. But why is it that groups of men everywhere just take control?
That's a good question, right? I'm not sure how to answer that question. You got me laughing on that.
That's good. Tell me about coups in Sahel, though. Why is the Sahel constantly used, first of all, as a region?
Yeah.
Tell us again, which are the countries that comprise the Sahel, and why is it so problematic?
So remember when I talked about the consensus against something, right? So if you think about, first, I think if you look at the countries in the Sahel, these are the countries that are most vulnerable economically on a good day. They are landlocked countries. Okay, so who are the countries? Which are the countries in the Sahel? We're talking about Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger. I guess you can say Chad to some extent. Again, it's that belt between the deserts and the greener areas, mostly landlocked countries. These are countries that start off being economically vulnerable, right? Mali, those places, they don't have a lot of resources. They're sparsely populated, don't have a lot of tax revenue. There's a lot of high unemployment. So you start off in a situation, and again, because it's landlocked, things are very expensive because it's hard to ship things in, it's hard to ship things out. So, you're spending a lot of money importing things. You start off with a lot of economic vulnerability, right? And then you layer on ineffective governments, again, who were thinking about just how to win the next election, and now they're coups or military regimes. And that's a part of what has made it so vulnerable. Why are coups coming back? Again, we've had all these years since the peak of the democracy movement in the 90s, when a lot of countries transitioned away from coups to military to democratic rule, and people are getting frustrated. After all these years, we're still not seeing the dividends of this democracy, right? We're not seeing inclusive growth. We're not creating jobs, and we want something different. It's a anti-establishment trend. We don't know what we want. All we know is that this is not working, right? This is not working. It's too corrupt. It's not focused on transformation. Give us something new. And the militaries in those places are taking advantage, and the populations are welcoming it again because they don't remember military rule and how bad it was, right? So I think it's that combination of starting with economic vulnerability, having a level of diversity, but people not feeling like there is a way to break into the system peacefully. And so you have more domestic support for anything that just
It's different.
turns it, yeah, up, upheaval. Just change it, give us something new, let's try something new. Kind of like what's happening in the US, right?
Very much what's happening in the US. When you were talking about the US being in creation, I thought that what you left out was that the US, for all that it had all those advantages, still goes to a civil war 90 years after it's created.
Exactly.
Sort of. So, of course, it's not easy.
Right.
Withstanding, though, one of the things that seems to be evident is that you have a retreat of France from these countries. These were
Yeah.
all French colonies in the colonial period.
Sahel, yeah.
But you now have Russia back there, China.
Yeah.
What are they interested in other than
Yeah.
the West?
So good question. I think the influence of Russia is overstated in the region. There's a lot of talk about, look, there is very little value add. There's very little that Russia can bring to the table. Russia can sell these countries weapons, and it has. It can offer some of the new military regimes personal regime security, but that's basically it. So I don't see Russia dramatically growing its influence. It's going to stay where it is. Yes, it can be a source of arms. Yes, it can be a source of security for military regime security. It's not even like security for the population. It's more about staying in power for the new military regimes that have taken power so I don't see I think the Russian influence is overstated. There is a lot of Russian propaganda that is taking advantage of all of the frustration we've been talking about today on this call, which is we're 65 years post independence. We're not seeing significant dramatic changes in our lives and our cost of living and our living standards. Who do we blame? Oh, it's the imperialists, it's the West, because the French have been here the whole time. And it's true that there were a lot of benefits that the French came out of independence with, right? In terms of access to business deals and ports, and even the currency, right, was backed up by France, with France taking some of the reserves and holding it in the French central bank, and they're walking back some of that now. But the perception was, well, if things are not going so well, but you must have a hand in this, right? Because you are exploiting it for your own good. And so Russia, the biggest influence Russia has had, in my view, has been to leverage that discontent to create more chaos, right? The West is really bad. Like they are the ones causing all this, fomenting all this insecurity and whatever to an extent that is probably overdone or far-fetched. On China, and so that's Russia. So I think a lot more influential in terms of propaganda and pushing
Fascinating. Yeah.
anti-Western views than it is in terms of really like expanding its in real hard influence or soft influence, really. Nobody wants to go to Russia for school and all that. Same with China to a different extent. So China has had a clear strategy in Africa that was focused on expanding its export market as well as obtaining natural resources for itself. And it has succeeded. It's had a good, I would say, a smart, successful strategy so far. And it's made mistakes, which we can talk about, and issues. But if you think about, I mean, if you look at the data, Chinese exports to Africa has grown consistently. And now most of the countries on the continent, their biggest partner is China, right?
Yeah,
US has been declining in terms of its economic relationship. What China has done better than its Western partners has been the rhetoric of focusing on economic partnership and positioning itself as if, I will not speak to the real intent, but position itself as if it is in China's interest, as if Africa's economic transformation is in China's interests. So centering the relationship based on investment and trade, and we want to help you create economic wealth versus the US has centered, again, rhetoric wise, has centered its relationship on we want you to look like us.
great.
We want you to have elections and do elections every 4 years and political rights and blah, blah, blah. And it feels more like floozy, right? Because we already believe all these things. We believe in, democracy is the best. So I think the US has been slower to pivot away, and it is doing it now to focus more on economic transformation or whatever, right? Investment deals, seeing Africa as a business opportunity rather than a charity case. I think so Chinese interests have been clear. It's been, they now control almost all of the processing of cobalt out of DRC. I mean, everybody's getting worried about that, right? And since April, this is a fascinating data point that we've been watching with my team at Eurasia Group, is that since April, since the tariffs, the fastest growing export destination for China in terms of trade diversion away from the US is Africa.
Sure.
And so it would seem that we're still looking at what's driving it, but all of the investments it's been making all these years into building relationships seems to be paying off, right? So as they're having to export less to the US, where are things going? Again, the other places, but the fastest growing one is
Fascinating. Really fascinating. But to what degree are African states also in debt to China?
so that has been overplayed. So we've been looking at the data. Yes, it's true that if you look at the debt profile of most African countries, most of it is multilateral institutions and commercial debts, mostly Western lenders, right? I would say so a smaller percentage of it is China. A smaller percentage of it is bilateral in general, but China happens to be one of the only countries that does a lot of bilateral debt financing, right? Because a lot of Western partners do it through multilateral institutions like the IMF and World Bank, which China doesn't do as much of. China does it bilateral country to country. So if you look at the big states like Nigeria, its external debt is only 10% to China. In South Africa, it's like less than 1%, right? The outliers have often defined the conversation. In a place like Zambia or Angola, that has a much bigger 40%, a much bigger exposure to Chinese debt. But it's not the norm, right? It's not the norm. So yes, there has been more exposure to Chinese debt in certain African countries. I can think of like two real outliers, Angola and Zambia. But for the most part, it's about 20% average or less or way less, right? Depending on where you are. So it's not, for me, I'm not that concerned about it because there's a debt problem in general. I'm more concerned about African countries just mobilizing more revenue so that they don't have to take as much debt. But from the African policy making perspective, being able to mobilize capital from as many different sources as possible is very useful, whether it's China or the West or Europe, right? And it's very hard to complain about that.
Absolutely. I'm finding this whole conversation absolutely fascinating, I have to tell you. It's sort of, when you speak to university professors, they've all got to explain to you why Africa is going nowhere in the fast lane. But you
Yeah.
know that that's not the case. It's just not,
Yeah.
notwithstanding what happened in Benin. Why is Benin a problem?
But there was a coup attempt in Benin last week. Was it last week? Look, I think that it's an important point that when you start to have something that looks like a trend. So there's been academics who've talked about the coup belt or like a coup fad. When you start to see things happen over and over, it gives people ideas, right? It gives discontented politicians in other countries ideas. The fact that the coups, so many coups have been successful, and then with the help of Russian propaganda, some of these coupists have portrayed themselves as the best thing since sliced bread. I'm talking about Burkina Faso in particular. There's a huge propaganda machine behind that guy. It is something that African policymakers should be worried about. Because when you have that sort of a trend, other people start to have ideas. And sometimes it's just a question of some disgruntled politician somewhere who feels they can't win an election. They're like, oh, well, maybe I could get somebody in the military to back the coup and I can get into power that way. And that's probably what happened in Benin. And luckily, it was averted, right? So it wasn't successful. But it reinforces that concern that yes, there are people who are going to think, okay, this is the moment, this is the trend. The people think this is a good idea. People like coups, people want military, so let's go make it happen. And it's a bigger risk for others. I still think that the most of Africans, where the majority of Africans live, Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, or even Angola, the majority of Africans where they live, a coup is unthinkable. I don't think we're going to see coups in those places. So it's still an outlier problem in the most vulnerable countries, because I think that the mentality has shifted away from that. People don't want to live in an authoritarian society, right? I think we've won the battle of the authoritarian versus democracy, right? That we're still talking about. But it is a concern that when you have this trend, it can give people ideas.
Okay, we are heading for the end of this fascinating conversation, so you're going to have to come back at least one more time in order to carry on talking. But we cannot, in all honesty, talk about Africa without, to a certain extent, mentioning Ethiopia and talking about Sudan, because they also represent another trend at the end of the day, which is a trend of, whether you want to call it tribal rivalries, ethnic rivalries, that explode into, and in the DRC, you still have parts of
Yeah.
the DRC which have exploded into these wars that go on at horrific cost. I mean, Sudan is now considered, I think, after Yemen and Gaza, the worst humanitarian disaster in the world.
Yeah.
We don't have to devote our whole conversation to this, but what is it? Why is it that it happens that way?
That's a big question. That it happens that they have these conflicts. Yeah, and look, I think it's a lot of very similar dynamics to what we've been talking about, right? The inability to create administratively functioning states that can deliver public goods allows people to and can deliver justice. Actually, that's a very important element that I haven't spoken about yet on this call, which is people need to feel that whatever is a sense of justice, that the state can deliver justice for them, right? So if somebody attacks me and kills members of my family, will they be prosecuted and justice delivered? And if not, then I'm more likely to go bring my community and get guns and attack them, right? So it's, to your core, why is this happening? It goes back to the problem of a failure to create capacity, administrative capacity. I'm talking about Sudan. And I'm not as familiar with the details of the war there. But I think broadly it comes back to that, right? And what I will say here, just in terms of how do we outlook and how should we be thinking about this, I think it's very important in policy, especially for US policymakers, for us to try to figure out how to center the idea of creating capable states in our how we think about how we want this country. So we focus for so many years on democracy, right? Elections and process. And I feel like our public narrative and how the media thinks about things, in terms of where we want things to go, should start to focus more on outcomes, delivering. And I understand the problems with that, the tensions with that, because, there's this idea of trying to distinguish between China and the US, and we're about process and they're about outcomes. But we have to figure out how to merge those two things, political rights because at the end of the day, it's the state's ability to deliver public goods is what effectively is the only thing that can avoid these kinds of conflicts, right? And figuring out how to merge our advocacy around political rights and democracy with the concrete. A state derives its legitimacy not by having an election, not by delivering political rights, but by delivering the things that make you a state, monopolizing violence, creating justice, and ensuring security for citizens, right? Delivering water, those things. And we have to figure out how to center that, in my view, in our advocacy and our broader Africa policy for US to avoid those kinds of conflicts.
I could go on and on and on. Thank you so much, Amaka Anku. That's a wrap on this episode of Women Leaders. Keep listening to our conversations and support us with a subscription on your podcast platform. Leave us a 5-star on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And of course, add to the conversation with your comments. In addition, help support our podcast and spread the happy word of this episode to friends, colleagues, enemies, family, and anyone you think would like it. We're on all media, so reach out on Instagram as @women_leaders_podcast and on ELN Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All information and links mentioned in this episode can be found in the notes. This is our last episode of this year, so happy holidays to everyone everywhere. I'm Ilana Bet-El, together with my friend and producer Florence Ferrando, and we'll be back very soon with another great conversation.